we're going to get things started for the fabulous Tyler Clark. He is a senior developer advocate for Auth0. Tyler has a passion for the web and loves everything about the front-end ecosystem. He currently works as a senior developer advocate at Auth0 as well as an instructor on Egghead.io. He teaches everything on a wide range of topics, which includes everything from CSS to SQL. And now, let us welcome Tyler to the stage.
All right. Okay, cool. I feel so official with this. Like a pop singer or something. All right, cool. Oh, it's on that side. Okay, cool. All right, yeah, thanks for the intro. I live here in Utah. My previous job was at Pluralsight, just up the road from here, and I currently work at Auth0, one of the sponsors here. I asked my company to sponsor because I've been here a bunch of times, and I love coming here, and I love the community. So got them to pass some money along to sponsor. But today, working at Auth0, it's an identity solution provider, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about identity for the JavaScript developer. Already had some introduction there. Yeah, I work at Auth0. I have some courses on Egghead.io. And you can find me on Twitter. I am Tyler W. Clark. That's where I'll post the link to the slides for this. But just a little history about myself. I started working with WordPress sites. I don't have a degree in CS or anything. I just kind of started learning myself. My first job, I worked for Boostability I think they're still around. But I was working on just WordPress sites and just kind of learning how to program myself. And so there's a lot of things that when you come from self-taught, there's a lot of things that you don't learn from a foundational standpoint. And one of those things was identity. And so I wanted to design this talk for everyone that doesn't have a lot of ideas or a lot of information about identity. And like there's a lot of buzzwords that go around in that, like JWTs, JSON Web Tokens, Authentication, Authorization, that kind of stuff. And so I wanted to put a talk together just for those of you that, like me, maybe are self-taught or don't know too much about the identity stuff, and kind of talk about some buzzwords and stuff. Because a lot of us work on, if you're a front-end developer in the JavaScript community, you work maybe with React, Vue, Angular, whatever it is, and you don't necessarily deal with identity stuff. That was me at my previous jobs. Typically, we had a team that kind of handled that identity solution. And a lot of us probably, if you're working for an enterprise-level software, don't do what that Kent does and roll your own authentication, which you can. But there's a lot to it. So when it comes to adding authentication or some type of identity solution to your app, sometimes you can feel like this kid, right? Everyone's seen this GIF or this GIF here of being excited to work on it, quickly learns to starting to cry, right, when you start actually getting into it. And so again, I just wanted to talk about some buzzwords, some little things that hopefully, if you're going through a coding interview or you're interested in learning more about identity or adding an auth to your app, you can at least know some buzzwords that come out as you read through docs and go through, the interviews and that kind of stuff. So some of the buzzwords, there's 7-ish that I'm going to talk through, and then give some diagrams and stuff of a deeper level of how this all kind of plays together. So I'm going to talk about what digital identity is. We'll talk about authentication, authorization, OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, JWTs, and claims. So the first buzzword, digital identity. So this is something that you'll hear a lot with my talk today, but the digital identity of a user is specific to an application. So it's going to be a bunch of attributes that make up your own identity within a application. So think about Amazon or any kind of e-commerce site. You're probably going to give your name, email, credit card information if that's being saved to the file, your date of birth, that kind of stuff. Each one of those attributes that you add to that application make up your specific user's digital identity. With that digital identity, applications want to know who you are when you access a page, right? And a really common word here is authentication. Now, I'm going to leave this slide, go to the next one. It's different from authorization, which we'll talk about. But those two words kind of go hand in hand, but they're also really different. Authentication is the most common thing is people will think of is the sign-in form, right? The username and password, that's going to be the authentication. But for an application to know who a user is, you need to prove yourself. The only way that an application can know who's actually visiting your page is by using some type of factor, such as username and password, but it can also be like, Kent mentioned the magic link, getting an email password, or getting an email link that automatically signs you in to a site. Whatever the factor is, whatever you're doing to log into an application, that is authentication. Now the second part of that is a very popular word called authorization. So after an application figures out who you are using authentication, the next point is authorization. Now these two words, if you remember anything, remember the differences between those two because it's really important. And I'm going to say it like 100 more times throughout the rest of this talk. So hopefully these sink in deep for you. But authorization is once you know who the user is using whatever factor, whether it be username and password or magic links to an email, now your application wants to know who that specific user has, what that user has access to. And you'll do that by the use of authorization. So the next buzzword was OAuth. And before we talk about OAuth, what that means today, I want to talk about what was the solution before OAuth came to be. So let's say that you have a to-do app. We're a user, we have a to-do app, whether you use the notes section of your computer or you just have a little list that you have going on your phone. Let's say you have a to-do app and you want to integrate it with your calendar app, Gmail, Outlook, whatever it is, because sometimes you put to-dos on your calendar. You want those two applications to talk to each other so that if I put it on calendar, it'll show up in my to-dos and vice versa. But in this case, specifically, you want to log into your to-do app and you want all of your calendar to-dos to be passed over to your to-do app. So before OAuth, this is how the flow would go. The to-do app would ask you for your credentials to the calendar app. So you would give your username and password for calendar app to the to-do app. The to-do app would then send those exact same credentials over to the calendar app and log in or authenticate as you yourself so that it can pull off the data that it needs or those to-dos to add to it. As you can imagine, this is a really bad experience because now the to-do app can do everything that you can do to it. So it can add events, delete events, it can change your personal settings, and obviously you're giving a lot of power to the to-do app when you really just want it to see your to-do that you've added to your calendar app. So there's two main problems, right? There's they can do everything that they can change settings and stuff, and they can get additional information about your own personal digital identity from the calendar app. So this is where OAuth came into play to kind of fix this scenario. And specifically 2.0 is the current version today. This is the open standard for performing delegated authorization. So we're allowing a particular app to work on your behalf with another app, but you're doing it in a certain way that avoids those two big pitfalls. Before we kind of dive into how that flow works, it's important to understand that OAuth does not work without an authorization server. And remember, the authorization, right, this is the part where you have a user, you know what they do, or you know who they are. Now you want to know what they have access to. And that all kind of comes down to having an authorization server with your application so that it can determine what that user has access to. So let's try this again using OAuth 2. And this is how it should be done today. So this is going to be the best. And a lot of your applications, you'll see this happening as you log in and work with other apps. So beforehand, your to-do app will need to do some type of registration with the calendar app. So if you're the to-do app in this room and you're making an application and you want to pull in data from other apps and you want users to work with you, your to-do app will need to do some type of registration with the calendar app and say, hey, I might be coming to you on behalf of a user, and I want to have an integration set in place so that I can pull in information. So to-do app needs to register with the calendar app behind the scenes before the user ever appears. The calendar app is going to have their own authorization server so they can deal with access management of particular users that are accessing to the to-do app and want to send information there. The to-do app is going to send a GET request once the user hits the to-do app and says, all right, let me throw in my to-dos. I want you, ToDo App, to pull in to-dos from my calendar app. So the ToDo App is going to send a GET request asking for help for a particular user to the calendar app. Now, we've all seen this within our day-to-day, and no matter if you're a programmer or not, you've seen this. A pop-up will appear, either a new tab or a little pop-up will appear on behalf of the calendar app. Now, the calendar app is going to initiate you signing into your calendar app in this little pop-up screen, right? We've all seen this. This is pretty common. And now I'm no longer giving my username and password to calendar app to the ToDo app to sign in on my behalf. I'm now calendar app saying, you know what, I'll make sure, let me log in this user, let me authenticate them, and then I'll tell you what they say that you can see or what they can't see. Also in this screen, you'll see consents. Usually there's another, once you authenticate, the next screen is like, what do you want the ToDo app to be able to see? Do you want them to see your settings? Do you want them to see their events? And you can specifically say yes, no, to whatever you allow them to see. Once that's all good and stuff, the calendar app is going to send back, all right, you're good to go. Here's a little code. The ToDo app's like, all right, here's the code back. They make a kind of a handshake agreement. And then the calendar app is going to respond again with a token. And we'll talk more about JSON Web Tokens here later on. But the calendar app is going to respond with something called an access token. That's also a very common identity buzzword there that you'll hear a lot. But the calendar app is going to respond with an access token. And inside of this token is everything that you agree to on the pop-up screen with the calendar app. It's going to have, there's a lot of information that comes in this token, which we'll break down later in the talk. But generally speaking, this is the way that the calendar app can limit what the ToDo app has access to. The ToDo app will use that access token, send it back to the calendar app with the user logged into the ToDo app, and say, hey, I have this token from the calendar app. Here's it back. Give me the information that I request. And the calendar app is going to respond with those to-dos. And now if I only gave the consent to the to-dos, then that's all that the ToDo app will have access to. It doesn't know my credentials. It can't update settings. It only is going to do what the access token that it received on my behalf as the user will allow it to do. Obviously, that means, again, no getting rid of sharing of credentials between multiple sites. So this kind of answers the question of what if I want to get data from, what if one application wants to get data or resources from one app to another app on behalf of a user visiting my page? But what if you want to do more than just get data? For example, what if I want to use a person's digital identity from Amazon and use that same identity within my own application? Right? All of us have accounts with very popular ones, and you'll see this whenever you're trying to create a new account on your favorite app, SaaS app, whatever it is, and you want to use your GitHub profile for this new app's sign-in. So you don't have to have another username and password. You can kind of combine those two. Well, this is something different-ish than what we just talked about with OAuth 2. Because OAuth 2 is not an authentication protocol. Remember, authentication and authorization, two different things. Before, OAuth is delegated authorization, how we can work with resources between multiple different apps. It's not an authentication protocol, so it's not going to tell me about the user or their digital identity. You might be thinking, well, I had an access token. What's in the access token? Well, there can be some user information in an access token. Generally, it's not, and it's not used in that way. Because an access token basically just says, these are the resources you're allowed to see. There's another security buzzword out there. It's called the confused deputy, and that's when you're working with an access token. You don't know who it is intended for, because it's not authenticating. It's just authorizing. There you go. It's only saying this is the data and the resources that you can work with. And so there needs to be an additional token. There needs to be an additional call or an additional protocol that you can work with to understand the identity of a user. And this is where the next buzzword here on my screen of 7 buzzwords that we're going over. The next one is OpenID Connect. You'll see this as OIDC. It's really popular buzzword that you'll see a lot. This is built on top of OAuth 2. So I just talked about it. Very similar to how that flow goes. has its own token that will be sent back. It's an ID token now versus an access token. And don't worry, we'll break down tokens here in a little bit. But this is now a separate token, and this token is designed to teach you about that user's identity, because this is now authenticating that user. So again, in this scenario, if you want to use GitHub or Amazon to use your sign-in for SaaS app X, then that authentication that you're doing with GitHub is now being transferred over to the other app that you're working with, your other SaaS app, and all that digital identity comes with it, and that comes with an additional token, the ID token. So now, instead of your own app, you're going to get whatever they allow to send over, but now you can work with some attributes of that user instead of your own app, set up by a separate app. It creates one login for multiple sites, right? So you can use your Google or GitHub username and password to access multiple sites. You'll have another redirect, just like we saw with OAuth 2. The info sent back in JWTs, JSON Web Tokens, and those JSON Web Tokens contain claims, which we'll see is just a object with key value pairs about a particular user. Inside of these ID tokens, they are a standard practice, so that they can be parsed in the browser. They are base64 encoded, so they work. You can verify them with a signature. These are not access tokens, so there's two tokens we're talking about today. ID tokens for after authentication. This is about the user. And there's access tokens, which is used with an authorization server that allows access with an API level, which allows the passing of resources. So you don't send an ID token to a server requesting for resources or particular data. ID tokens are used in your browser to work with the identity of a particular user. So if you want to show their email, if you want to show their name or whatever it is, this is going to be sent on an ID token. Now, I mentioned this a lot, and actually the talk right after me is going to go deeper into JSON. Kira is going to go deeper into JSON Web Tokens. So if you want to go deeper into this than I'm going to go today, feel free to stick around. But just as a high level, you'll hear JSON Web Tokens thrown around a lot, JWTs as they're called. It's an open standard that defines a compacted way of passing information through the browser. And they'll look something like this. On the left-hand side here, it's just a bunch of uppercase, lowercase letters separated by 2 dots, because a JSON Web Token is separated between 3 different segments. The first one in red is the header. So this is going to define the algorithm, the token type. The second, purple, is going to be payload. This is a very small payload, a very small JSON Web Token here. Gives a subname and a IIT, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And then the blue is the signature. So because we live in the day today, you can modify tokens in transit, so there needs to be some way of verifying that nothing has been changed inside of your application. We'll let you get a picture real quick. There you go. Okay, yeah, so JSON Web Tokens, we've seen that there's 2 different types, right? There's ID tokens and there's access tokens. Those are JSON Web Tokens. Authentication is used by the OpenID Connect, ID tokens. Authorization is the access token. And because they can be signed, you can pass information back and forth. Auth0 does maintain this site, JWT.io, jwt.io, super easy. And that's actually the screenshots that you're seeing are from JWT.io. You can actually grab access tokens that are sent on any of your applications today. You can actually grab them from outside of the authorization header in the fetch request in your DevTools. And you can paste it on this site, JWT.io, super easy. I don't have internet, or I would show you. And it'll decode that JWT for you. So you'll see this view on your access token. So if you're working with access tokens in your app, go ahead and grab one of those and throw it in there and see what it looks like. So again, yeah, it's JWT.io. Just throw that into the little section here, and it'll spit it out for you so you can see what it looks like. All right, so we talked about OAuth, we talked about ID tokens, access tokens, just making sure we're all on the same path here. How did we end on JSON Web Tokens? Well, we talked about OAuth 2, right? That's the authorization, delegated authorization. Then we talked about OpenID Connect, which is built on top of OAuth, and it's a way of getting an ID token about a user and authenticating them. And then we've talked about how access and ID tokens are JSON Web Tokens. So this is a much larger token that we're looking at here. This one is going to be a access token. So they're going to look the same, but they're going to have different claims as we call it here, and we'll talk about inside this payload section here. And with tokens, there are some reserved ones, but you can customize the claims that we see. So inside that payload, you can see I've circled ISS, sub, and audience is an array here. You can add additional things to these, and these are called claims. It's the key value pair inside the payload there. So there are some reserved claims inside of this that you can't mess with as a developer. The ISS is the issuer of the JWT, subject of the JWT for sub, and AUD is the recipient of which the JWT is intended. But if you're working with ID tokens, you're working with your application, you can modify those, you can add additional claims to that. So if you're working with an application that you've built and you want to grab additional information about a user, for example, their email, their address, and you want to display that on a My Profile page, you can add those custom claims to that if you're managing your own authentication. Or if you're working with someone like Auth0, then you can go into your dashboard and add those to the claims, the tokens as they get generated. So quick recap, we've talked about digital identity, authentication, right? This is the sign-in or the factors. So you get a text code, you type it in, that's authentication. Authorization, right after the app knows who you are, you send that token to an authorization server. It determines what you have access to. OAuth 2 is kind of the flow in which you can consent to the delegation of authorization between multiple apps. There's OpenID Connect for getting an ID token, whether that comes from your own application, your own authorization server, or you're working with another social connection like Google or GitHub. These tokens are JWTs, JSON Web Tokens, and on the tokens there are claims about a user or about their access, depending on if you're working with ID tokens or access tokens. All right, so there's a lot of buzzwords there, and there's a lot going on there. So how does this actually apply to if I'm just a JS developer in the front end, right? I'm just working in CSS every day. How does this actually apply to me as a JavaScript developer? So let's talk about this. Let's put this into like an actual real life, or it's not real life because we're just drawing pictures here. But how do we make this flow as me? I have a SaaS idea, or I have an app idea, React, Angular, whatever you're using. How do I get this to work with my own application? How do I add an identity to it? So you have an application, it loads in the browser, you have your users, and you just want everything to work with security-wise. So you're going to have a browser, you're going to have some type of API, then you also need some type of authorization server, whether that's all on the same server, your API and database, or whatever, but you do need to have some type of differentiation there. And it sounds like with Kent, he rolled his own, so he did his own authorization server, he's done his own API and database setup, and so this is for you as well. If you wanted to get this to all work cohesive with your own app, this is kind of the flow, right? Browser, your app, it loads it, you have an API, and you need some type of authorization. A user visits your page, and you're now going to send credentials to your server saying, hey, user X has come to my page, they've given me my username and password, and now I need to pass this on to my server. The server is going to say, all right, that looks good, they passed the factors, here's your access and ID token, so your server will respond with both of those tokens to your now app that's running in the browser. A lot of companies work with cookies. You can also store that information in a session in your browser. You can put it in a web worker. Basically, you just want to hide it so that those tokens don't get manipulated in transit. So, but a cookie is stored on your browser session. Now that you have that the access token that can come back from your authorization server, so you know what this user has access to, then you send that token on a fetch request. You're using Axios, whatever it is. You put it inside of the header of your call. So you put that access token, that big long string of upper and lower case characters. You put that on an authorization header inside your fetch request. So if it's /API, /profile or data, you put that token inside of your header of your JSON fit, of your JavaScript fetch. Your API database says, looks good. You're able to see this particular amount of resources, whether it's data or whatever it is, and that responds back to your browser. So in every other subsequent request that you're working with as your users go through the different pages, you're constantly sending that access token back and forth to your API so that you can make sure that your routes are always protected, your resources are always protected. And because of this token, your server and API can validate that the user is who they say they are, and then they have the right access to what they have the right access to. Now, what happens when a user refreshes the page? So let's say that you've lost your browser state, right? So unless you're storing it somewhere in the local storage, on a refresh, that all goes away, right? Unless you're caching it yourself. But that cookie that was set from the response back from your authorization server, that's going to be saved. And there is a life cycle to cookies and to access tokens, which there should be for security. That way they don't live forever and you only have one. But if a user accesses your site, your application needs to have some code that checks the session, checks the cookies, whatever's been saved, revalidates it, and then if that cookie is good and your authorization server is good with it, then it'll respond back with a new set of access and ID tokens. So here you need code on your authorization server if you're rolling your own identity. You need code on your app that's doing this logic back and forth, making sure that it's validated, that it hasn't been changed. You check the signature, you check the JWTs, make sure it all works. And as you can see, I'm saying kind of hand waving here a lot of stuff because there is a lot more stuff to this. I'm just kind of giving the buzzword type stuff and the tip of the iceberg of how to get this to work. But at least hopefully now you can kind of understand the flow of this. It's not just throw a username and password login form on your page and then magic happens, that now your site is secure. No, there's a lot more to it. There's figuring out who our user is when they access the site, figuring out what they have access to when they access their site. What if I want someone to use their GitHub profile to log into my app? How do I do that? Well, we've talked about that's OpenID Connect. So hopefully as you go into like other interviews or whatever, that you can kind of hear those buzzwords and it makes a little sense to you. But there's companies like myself, Auth0, FusionAuth, speaking after me, that make this a little bit simpler. And I kind of want to just walk through, if you're using a React app, what that would look like in your code. So instead of having to worry about the handshake, working with social providers like GitHub, Google, Gmail, whatever it is to make that connection, I want to show what an SDK looks like in order to get this working in your React app. So any good SaaS app is going to have a good SDK, and this is an example of Auth0's. So if you're working with React, how many people work with React? All right, mostly everyone looks like. Okay, so this is a pretty easy dumbed down example here. So context, right? So you wrap your app, if you're using Create React App, with a Auth0 provider, a provider element that's going to put everything into a context so that you can then reference it later on. You give it your specific domain for that's your Auth0 domain. A key, your own client ID. Whenever you sign up for Auth0, you'll get these two things. And then where you want it to redirect to. But you wrap your entire app with this provider component. And then you can import, as you can see at the top here, we have this use Auth0 from Auth0-React. You can import this hook, and then you can, inside of this hook is going to be a lot of functionality built into it that's going to create the login form. It's going to create the redirect. It's going to create the social connection between the two. So now all I have to do is destructure a login with redirect function and put that onto my button on click. Now when this button is clicked, it will redirect my user to a secure authentication page that a user can then put in their credentials or however you've configured your Auth0 account, whether you're using the magic link or if you're doing a text code, however you determine that in your Auth0 dashboard, that's what's going to happen. But from your own app, this is all that you need to do. I have a little check here if that user's authenticated or not. And if not, then I'm going to show the login with redirect button the log in, and it's going to redirect them. Same thing with log out. So if they're authenticated, then we show the log out, which is a function that just comes destructured off of useAuth0. Is that time? Okay, almost done. And it'll redirect them. You can get their, if you want to work with the ID token, you can get their name. It's just the user off the useAuth0 hook. You can get the access token, same thing, and you can send that onto the fetch request. And there's a lot more. So when working with SDKs, we try to make it as easy as possible, protecting routes, handling errors, checking loading states, all that stuff. And there's SDKs for whatever SPA library you're using, Angular, Vue, just vanilla JavaScript. But yeah, you can find me walking around. I live here in Utah as well, so you might see me around, but that's it. Thanks.